that, I'll call to order the public hearing for Tuesday, December the 12th to consider Bylaw 2017-36, Land Use Bylaw Update. And for any in the audience that aren't familiar with process, administration will give a briefing. There is no applicant, so it'll just be administration speaking. Then there'll be questions of clarification from members of council for directed to admin. And then I'll invite members of the public to speak to the item. I ask that people stick to the 5-minute time limit. And there is a clock on the wall, so you can keep your eye on that. And when you take the mic, just make sure that your name is clearly identified for the records, and if you can indicate, well, I guess there's not really in support and oppose and neutral on this one, is there? Anyways, let us know what you think. And at that time, I'll look to the municipal clerk to read into the minutes the names of those who provided written submission. There'll be an opportunity, if necessary, for final administration comments, and then I'll adjourn the public hearing. And you're welcome to move closer to the front if you like. With that, so I'll invite Mr. Prevost to come forward and give the presentation.
Good evening, Council and members of the public. I'm Lee Prevost with the town's planning department. Tonight's public hearing is just a review of our 2017 land use bylaw updates, and they'll cover schedules that are very similar to what we brought forward in the fall. We focused these revisions on items that were not contentious or that through additional stakeholder conversations we found a reasonable level of support. So the 3 schedules we are reintroducing are the land use bylaw formatting, our first omnibus amendments, and updates to the green building regulations. And this is the timeline we're currently working on for the process. So we started our stakeholder engagements in November. First reading was November 21st, public hearing tonight, of course. And then if all goes well, we'll move to second and third readings in January. Here's a summary of the formal stakeholder events that have been held to date. And because of the similar content earlier this year, we've been able to build off the engagements that we held in the summer and the fall. Through all of these events, we've found a reasonable level of support. And because of that support, and because these changes are foundational to the next round of updates we plan to introduce for 2018, we're recommending a fairly tight turnaround to second and third readings in the middle of January. If, however, we receive feedback that we're moving too quickly, we're prepared to adjust these timelines. So this is a list of what's not included in this round of updates. It's also a list, therefore, of the land use bylaw amendments we would like to introduce for 2018. There's no rezoning of municipally owned sites. Development-specific components like roof heights and driveway locations are not included. We're not addressing affordable housing issues like accessory dwelling units, employee housing, or tourist homes, and not touching on Steep Creek, sustainability screening, cannabis regulations, or the TP Town District. But none of these are being addressed this time, but we will bring them back in 2018. So the first schedule up for review is the changes to the formatting of the land use bylaw. And they're intended to make the land use bylaw easier to navigate, simpler for us to amend in the future, given the number of updates we have coming forward, and to ensure that the sections follow logically in an order that's similar to how development typically occurs. So this is a sample of those changes. Areas in red highlight examples of items that are being removed or relocated to other sections. The blue shows additions and rearrangements. And we've included room in the overall structure that allows us to expand or remove clauses as this bylaw evolves over time. Through all of the stakeholder engagement dating back to last summer, we've received no opposition to these changes, which are really just intended to make the bylaw easier for anybody to follow. So the second schedule we brought forward are the first omnibus amendments. And they're intended to reflect updated direction that we've received through the municipal development plan and to clarify sections that may have proven ambiguous in the past, while we also try to improve the consistency of the terminology that we use. In some instances, we've removed clauses that are duplicated elsewhere in the bylaw, and we're correcting errors that have been uncovered through this review. We want the bylaw to be easy to understand. We want our current interpretation practices to be evident in the clauses wherever possible. I'm going to highlight 3 particular sections of the omnibus amendments that are being revised. The first is related to bed and breakfasts. We want to recognize that a single-family home is the same regardless of whether it lands in an R1 or an R2 district, so that we can ensure consistent interpretation for any single-family built home. As long as the use proves compatible for the residential purpose in the area in which it's going to be located, B&Bs will be a discretionary use in R2 districts, again, only for single-family homes. The second significant revision is for us to adopt fire-smart guidelines for new developments in Canmore. The MDP recognizes that Canmore's proximity to wilderness exposes the town to a greater risk from wildfire. We've been requesting additional wildfire risk assessments for a couple of years now, but these changes will require fire-smart strategies to be included with all applications. And the focus will be on reducing the chance of fire spreading via close proximity landscaping or combustible building materials. We acknowledge that there are concerns that construction costs could be increased through this process, but we note that efforts to mitigate against catastrophic damage from wildfire are critical to protecting our town, and they meet the test of being part of the greater public interest. An example of the changes that could be required are sort of seen in this image. The concentric rings essentially outline areas where more and more specific and stringent requirements would be required. So the very far away one, zone 3 in yellow there, that's the 30-meter to 100-meter distance from the building. And what might be required in there are things like thinning of the vegetation, pruning, or fire breaks. These typically would not land on the actual single property developer's responsibility because they're so far away from the house. This would be more redeveloping an entire area or something that the town may undertake and in some instances has undertaken in the past. And then all the way down to the closest concentric ring. In this case, it's meant to be within 1.5 meters of the building, where you would not be allowed any combustible materials or landscaping in that zone. Not all mitigations would be required for every site, but they would be determined based upon an existing wildfire hazard map for Canmore, a map that can be updated whenever a significant new amount of development is coming online. We also recognize that Canmore has particular site and development characteristics, so we want to craft these guidelines in partnership with local industry and fire experts so that we ensure the changes will have a very Canmore specific focus. And the last area that I want to highlight is overland flow areas. And building upon experiences we gained through the 2013 flood, we want to formalize where Canmore's high water districts are and harmonize overland flow area requirements with those that exist for flood fringe areas. And I'll show you a map that'll sort of explain that in a second. We want to focus on areas of highest risk, and these updates will embed design requirements intended to minimize the impacts to people and property for floods up to and including 1 in 100. So this is the existing flood map for Canmore, and the most current provincial mapping in Alberta right now is from 1999. So the salmon-colored areas of the map identify areas called flood fringe, and these are areas where there were building code updates introduced in 2013 that designate minimum floor heights that are intended to reduce the damage to structures and mostly heating, ventilation, and air conditioning systems. Because the map is from 18 years ago, it doesn't take into account areas we know that flooded, overland flow areas from the 2013 event. Those are the ones that we've shaded slightly in pink, basically in between the salmon-colored flood fringe areas. And this is our effort to fill in the gaps that exist in this old flood hazard mapping and be able to include similar levels of protection by way of minimum floor heights that we have for the flood fringe areas. There's been some concern that the introduction of minimum floor heights could lead to could unintentionally restrict the maximum height of buildings that could be built in these areas. So just to be clear, the maximum roof heights will be adjusted and account for raised minimum floor heights. Essentially, all properties would have the same buildable vertical height, regardless of what their minimum floor height was. We also know that the province is in the process of updating these maps, so we expect to bring back further changes once those maps have been released. So the last schedule we're bringing forward are the updates to Canmore's green building requirements, which under the MDP commit Canmore to being a leader in sustainable practices that protect the environment. The regulations are broken down into two groups, those for small-scale residential and those for large-scale residential, commercial, industrial, and institutional, like hospitals and schools. For small-scale development, the updates respond to changes last year to the Alberta Building Code, which had the province adopt Canada's 2011 Energy Code, which uses the Energy program to identify maximum energy consumption targets for houses in an effort to reduce the amount of greenhouse gas emissions in our province. Our program has always required developments to exceed minimum standards, so the proposal here is to require new housing in Canmore to consume 10% less energy than those Energy targets. These updates include laddered incentives and penalties, which will reward or penalize building performance that ends up being better or worse than these Energy targets. For large-scale projects, developments in Canmore have always been expected to exceed the 1994 Energy Code requirements by 25%. Since the province has now adopted the 2011 Energy Code, we've heard from stakeholders who are supportive of green building regulations that because these new requirements are so much more stringent than the ones from 20 years ago, a reasonable period of time to adapt design and construction practices is warranted prior to being required to exceed those levels, which has been our practice in the past. So we've responded to that concern, and through collaborative work with the industry, we've got three options that we're proposing for developers. The first is simply to meet the new 2011 Energy Code targets. There would be no incentives or penalties for either exceeding or missing those targets. But because the new requirements are so much more stringent, there will be an improvement over our current practice. The second option is to meet the even newer 2015 Energy Code, which is in practice in other parts of Canada, but has not been adopted here in Alberta yet. And it requires about a 12% improvement over the 2011 code. We would incent this increased level of performance by considering variances in areas such as building height, setbacks, coverage density, and parking. Variances that are in excess of those that are typically available. And the last option would be for large developments to exceed the 2015 Energy Code. In addition to the variances I've just outlined for option number 2, developers who exceed the 2015 targets would be eligible for a reduction in the amount of subdivision and development securities that we would typically hold. That's how we would incent it. For both these second and third options, failure to meet the respective Energy Code requirements would result in forfeiting an escalating amount of performance securities, anywhere from 10% to 100%, depending on the severity of the missed level of performance. And to ensure that these regulations encourage better green building performance for any type of development, the industry and the town have agreed to review these incentives and penalties in about a year and make changes if required. Also, changes could occur if the province were to introduce or adopt a new Energy Code. Just before we wrap up, there were 2 questions we received at first reading that we weren't able to give fulsome answers to, so I'll go over them really quickly. The first was, do we have a minimum fence height requirement in the bylaw that would contradict the conditions in clause 4.1.1.1. And that clause essentially says that on a corner lot, no item will be erected between 1 meter and 4 meters high that would serve to restrict visibility from a public roadway. And the shorter answer is no, we do not have a minimum fence height in the bylaw, so nothing would be impacted here. The second question, if I have it correct, is would we allow 2 home occupations or 1 home occupation and 1 bed and breakfast use to occur on the same property? The answer is that yes, it's possible, but these are discretionary uses, and we would be looking for applicants to show us that there would be no negative traffic or parking implications, that the businesses would still be subordinate to the residential use of the property, and that taken all together, these uses would not unduly impact neighbors' enjoyment to the quiet residential neighborhood, which is specifically outlined in the clause. So that concludes my presentation. Thank you, and we're happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much. Well, I don't have a number of questions since first reading and when we had quite a bit of dialogue, but just one prompted from your comments right now around the anticipation of the province redesigning their flood hazard map. Do we know when we're expecting that?
We don't have a firm deadline. We've heard annually since the flood that there would be new flood mapping. We anticipate, because we are 4 years past now, it could be any time, but we don't want to hold up what are good mitigation solutions while we wait for that mapping.
Okay, just the way you described that, it sounded like we had heard something more specific from the province, that they're actually working on it, or?
No, well, we know they're working on it. I guess I'd say annually we hear it's coming this year, so I don't know exactly how to. I guess we're not certain when that would come forward. Yeah.
Mr. Fark, did you have something on that?
So based on the most recent information I had from engineering, we're not anticipating anything before next year sometime at the earliest.
Next year being
2018.
2018.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Which is soon. Thank you. Sorry. So just a question for clarification, and something that when I was reading the Schedule B prior to first reading, and since then, I've been assuming something. I just want to make sure my assumption is correct. And I'm looking at the 4.7.3.2 around shipping containers, and the new direction that shipping containers may be used as elements of building envelopes. And I've been assuming that that's largely in response to the requests we've had from the community around tiny home building and how shipping containers can be used to reduce the cost of home construction.
That's correct.
Yeah.
We don't want to limit the built form,
yeah.
So we're introducing it as an option.
It just occurred to me, I thought, well, maybe there's another reason for that.
No.
Are there any questions from members of council? Seeing none, thanks very much for your presentation.
Thank you.
So at this time, I'll invite members of the public to speak to the bylaw. As I've suggested, just come on up, give your name. Okay, Alistair's first. And let's hear what you have to say.
Hi guys, my name's Alistair Russell. I guess I'm here in my professional capacity of Russell & Russell Design Studios to examine the non-contentious end of the changes to the bylaw. So it's nice that they are the non-contentious end. I'd slightly dispute that description, as well as the further information regarding driveways not being included in this round of bylaw changes. As far as I can see, they still are. One of the three means at the last hearing that driveways were addressed was one in the driveway access location bylaw, the other one in the definitions, and the other one in a portion of the bylaw about secondary suites, where it was suggested that some of the requirements would be waived in order for the driveway to be placed around the back. So those two aren't in at the moment. However, there is one that's, I don't know, very great concern to me that is still in at the moment, and that is the page 7 of your Schedule B, which contemplates changing the English language. I'm not sure what the reason for this is. At the moment, there are 4 types of sort of operative words in the bylaw. One is must, it is the mandatory word. The other one is may, it's the non-mandatory word. And we've got should and shall in the middle. Unfortunately, it appears that almost all of these are going to be changed. As you can see in the section 1405, may means a choice is available with no particular direction or guidance intended. So that's the first one of our non-mandatory bylaws that the town is changing. I guess it's a clarification. So the clarification apparently is may means a choice is available and denotes discretionary compliance or the ability to alter the requirements as presented, which to me sounds like the definition of the word should. Definition of the word should in the old bylaw, which isn't included in this, was that it was a bylaw that was strongly encouraged. So when you look at the revised definition of should, it appears to get closer to the definition of shall. Should means that the regulation is strongly encouraged. That's what the rule was before. Alternatives can be proposed where the policy is not reasonable or practical in a given situation or where a unique or unforeseen circumstance, provided the course of action would satisfy the general intent of the policy. However, the general intent is for compliance. That is the current definition of the word shall. So if you have a building that you want to make a couple of feet higher, that's the operative word that you have to deal with. So to me, to change all of our operative words up the scale to mandatory words instead of non-mandatory words and mandatory words, the combination, I think shows either a determination to change the driveway bylaw or a misunderstanding of the general principles of bylaws. Is that we've worked on a street where we were refused a front driveway, and we weren't strongly encouraged. We were refused. We had to go to a development permit board hearing where an enormous amount of misinformation was contained, and we had to fight tooth and nail to get what in the old definition should have been something that did not require a variance. So for this minor change will have a huge effect on numerous bylaws, including the driveway bylaw. And I'm very, very alarmed at the idea that we would have to justify and provide legitimate reasons to be allowed a front driveway. Because the number one on my list, or I should say my clients' lists, is they want a backyard for their children or grandchildren or flowers or something of that nature. So for me to have to come to a bylaw, a subdivision development board hearing and not to be able to say that's why they decided it, not because the driveway bylaw has been changed, but because we're redefining the English language, I think that there has to be a solution that doesn't seem to use a back door to change our bylaw, which at the moment is, according to the town, not being changed.
Good timing.
Well, I have lots more to say.
I'm sure you do. Thank you very much, Mr. Russell. As you know, we don't try to debate any of the points you're making. We're just here to hear. We're here to listen. But generally, admin will respond to what we hear at the public hearing at second reading. So I'll look forward to that. Mr. Hill? Oh, Mr. Fark, you have something to add?
I would actually like to request council's indulgence for 1 minute while I can discuss with my colleagues. There seems to have been a version control issue with what got published in the public agenda.
I see.
The section that Mr. Russell just spoke to was actually removed from, or was intended to be removed and not considered as part
The
of.
section on driveways?
That's correct, on the definition of should. Was not intended to be included as part of this package. So I would like to have a quick conference with my colleagues here and discuss a way forward, please. Can you give us a 2-minute
Sure.
recess?
Yeah, we'll just give them a
Jeez,
moment.
if I'd known I'd have an extra 2 minutes, I would have come with some jokes or a little dance routine or.
We'll just,
Oh, no, that I can't.
ding, 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 ding.
So I
Call
am
the
about
public hearing
to,
back to order.
I'm about to make use of my favorite phrase once again and do a mea culpa. So what it seems to have happened is that the version of the bylaw that was approved at first reading was not the version that got included in the public agenda package that was published on the website. We're not entirely sure how that has occurred, but that is the situation. So in light of that, we are suggesting that we can continue with the public hearing. People can continue to make comments on issues that they have an interest in commenting on, but administration will be recommending a holding of a second public hearing once a clarity on the correct agenda package going out to the public is made.
Okay. Sounds reasonable. So with that in mind, happy to hear from other members of public comments on the bylaw that was in the public.
There is also an option to allow Mr. Russell another 5 minutes, since he wasted his first 5 minutes on a topic that we intended to have.
He'll have 5 minutes at the next public hearing.
He can have his another 5 minutes now, or he can do it at the next public hearing, whichever he prefers.
Well,
I'm still not clear. Are you saying the section 1405 is the bit that should be included?
Yes, so that whole paragraph that you're talking about should, was meant to be removed. And was not intended to be, and was not what was included in what was approved at first reading.
Okay, admin error, your mea culpa accepted. I will withdraw my complaints.
Mea culpa. Mr. Hill, if you'd like to speak to the version of the bylaw that you've seen in the public agenda. Councillor Sanford.
I'm not sure. I'm checking the two agendas, and in my agenda of 2017-11-21, that clause is there. So that, you're just mentioning that it wasn't in first reading, but I have it highlighted and that clause is there. So our version had it in at first reading.
Unfortunately, there's a version control issue. We have, in some places on our files, we have one version. I agree. I've just found it now. It does look like the November 21st version at first reading was there. So that's likely how it got included as the public agenda. I suspect some changes happened anyway.
So
we're going to have to review it.
Okay. We did approve it, but you didn't intend for it to be in there, so.
I think that's actually what it sounds like, is that it was approved at that version. Changes were made to remove it, but they weren't affected at the November 21st. So the first reading and the public hearing are likely correct in what legally has been approved at first reading. That was not our intent, and we're not realizing that until now.
Okay, thank you. Just to clarify.
So where does that leave you?
Here.
Technically, first reading, it appears, and we will have to do some more checking, but appears to have been passed on the bylaw that was presented as part of the public hearing package, i.e. including the comment that Mr. Russell was speaking about. That was not the intent, but we'll have to, I want to confirm, although it certainly seems like that version from November 21st included the version that we're looking at tonight.
So the council approved first reading land use bylaw amendments.
Yes.
Right. And what was approved first reading was in the public package?
I believe so. That's what it looks like now, as Councillor Sanford has pointed out. Unfortunately, there are two versions on the hard drive. There's a PDF of the entire council package that includes the version that is before us tonight. There are other versions that were edited that seem not to have made it into the November 21st and hence the public hearing agenda for tonight. I don't know why or how that happened.
Okay. I think I'll call a short recess and we'll go upstairs and have a little chat. Council. We'll be back shortly.
relaxation is a full story. So the percentage, I urge you, does not apply, it cannot apply with these variances, especially we're talking about maximum building height. We're talking about variances on parking. Some of your council will worry about that the latest development, could it be turned into condo or not? And the planning department advise you, no, because there's not enough parking. With this, the planning department, helter-skelter, overnight can reduce it by 25 parking lot, which is just about puts them to be able to turn it to condominium immediately. We're talking about 124, direct control. Unfortunately, anytime when we have a problem with any kind of a zoning here, you people religiously turning it into a direct control. Direct control, I call it dictatorial control, because the people do not have no more input after the zoning. After the zoning is done, is all done by somebody, sometime, someplace, with various variances, and that's wrong. I think if you have already 7 or 8 different R1s, that yes, you can do new zoning for areas where you don't know what to do with it, rather than having all kinds of direct zoning all over town. I am deadly against that 1 meter variance maximum on a boat trail, which is in 2, 3, 3, 4, 6, and you already had comments that you have the skyscrapers against the lot line and covering up our only sellable item, which are the mountains. What we enjoy as well as the tourist enjoys. This is 3, I'm 81 years old, is 4135. Wheelchair ramp may be permitted, etc., etc. I think I'm not an English professor, as you probably hear the last 40 years. I hear it myself, 61 years. The may, it does, should not apply. It should be accepted, a wheelchair ramp, within decency, without flowers and whatever. But what is a usable ramp, we should allow our old people, including me, to enter our house on the front, not as on the back. We haven't got money to develop the back and back to go to the back center, back place. 412, we're talking about building setback for future road widening on Bow Trail. I don't think that the Bow Trail widening is accepted. So how can we accept the bylaw on a future widening when it's not accepted by? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there any other comments from members of the public? Anyone wishing to speak? I'm going to take that as a no. Nobody else wants to say anything? In which case I'll look to the municipal clerk to read into the record the names of those who provided written submissions.
Thank you. We received a written submission from Boda, who also spoke this evening. We received a written submission in favor also from Three Sisters Mountain Village, and 2 submissions providing comments, recommendations, and concerns, neither in favor nor opposed. Karen Antrobus and Don Hines.
Sorry, what was the second name?
Don Hines, H-E-I-N-Z.
Thank you. Are there any final administrative comments? Mr. Prevost? Did you have a comment? Just a sec.
Administration, because it seems like we're getting to the end of the public hearing. Is that possible, Your Worship?
Yeah.
Perfect. I was wondering if you could clarify the fire smart regulations for me. There may be a misconception about what they are intending to do and how they would apply. So my questions are, how would subdivisions and new homes be designed going forward next to forested areas? What's the intention? And would there be a general setback from forested areas, or does the 10-meter perimeter only apply around buildings?
I'm going to answer that broadly, and then I can get a little more focused
Sounds
if required.
great, thank you.
We're actually working with industry and Stu Walkinshaw, who is the local fire expert on Fire Smart. And these are the exact questions that were being brought up. What is the responsible but reasonable level of mitigation that makes sense? Everything from development that occurs immediately adjacent to the wilderness to, as was mentioned by Mr. Hill and Boda, sorry, Mr. Rempel as well from Boda, to across the street from that to right down into the town center. We believe our guidelines will identify, based on risk hazard, differences. It'd be very hard to be crystal clear that it would be the same in all areas because the risk hazard changes as you go out all through Canmore. So we would base it on the existing risk hazard map from WildSmart, if that helps.
Fire Smart.
Fire Smart, sorry, yeah. Wildfire risk hazard from Fire Smart. Did that help a little bit?
I think so, yeah.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Oh, I guess, and then so, no, you answered my question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Are there any other final administrative comments or points to clarify? Seeing none, thanks for being here this evening, and I'll now adjourn the public hearing. We're done.